Literature and Writing 338 students. One way to distinguish between Golden Age literature and New Realist literature, which we learned about last week with Wrinkle in Time, is to consider where the conflict the child is trying to resolve arises and where that conflict gets resolved. In Golden Age children's literature, the conflict usually arises in the other world, and it's fixed in the other world, as with Dorothy, whose initial conflict was that they wanted to go home. There were other conflicts that arose, but initially it was, oh, how do I get home? And that was the conflict, which was then resolved there. And what happened in the other world really didn't have much effect on the real world in Golden Age literature. In a lot of the examples, that's one of the conventions. But in New Realist children's literature, and also in the young adult literature that arose from New Realist children's literature, we often see the conflict arising in the real world, like Meg's lost father. But the fix or the resolution comes in the other world, like Meg going literally to another place to rescue her father. So this week, we shift into young adult fiction, a group of texts that are intimately connected to children's literature and grew out of children's literature. YA, or young adult YA fiction, is technically still part of the larger umbrella of children's literature, but it is treated and it's become in many ways its own thing. But technically it is still literature for people under 18, which is technically considered children, but it's also often talked about separately and it's certainly marketed a little differently. Just like we can't have children's literature until we have a certain idea of children as creatures that are different from adults who need to be treated differently, and thus need their own separate stories, we can't have YA literature, young adult literature, until we have a perception of older children, teenagers, as distinct from younger children, and occupying their own niche in the world of childhood, which is part of what Lesson 10 covers for this week. So it's okay with me if you treat YA as different from children's lit, even though they're technically in the same category. The definition of children's lit that I proposed at the beginning of class was essentially literature designed for children. With YA, the situation is similar. It's literature designed for, young adults. But there's an added element that wasn't necessarily true about Golden Age children's literature. It's not just that the texts are designed for young people, but that the content deals with issues central to that age group and development stage. We get a little bit more into the concerns of actual children when we get into New Realist children's literature, and even more so when we get into YA lit. In fact, it is specifically the trend of New Realist children's literature that paves the way for YA lit, which is why it shares many of the same characteristics and conventions as New Realist children's literature, and why I have them in the same unit, Unit 3. YA Lit deals with sexual maturity, with taboo issues, with experimentation, with reconsideration of core values, with parental relationships, and so on. Those are all true of YA Lit, which develops in the same milieu and with the same influences of New Realism. Another sort of little point I just want to pick up on quickly is that all of the children's literature we read up until now has featured elements of a non-realistic otherworld, some kind of fantasy world or space where there are things that can happen that don't happen in the real world, whether that's the chocolate factory or Wonderland, or Under the Sea in Little Mermaid. These are all known as speculative fiction. So the genres of fantasy, sci-fi, and horror all together are called speculative fiction, or fiction that sort of speculates about reality rather than representing it. Even in the texts of New Realism that we read featured realistic elements and, fantasy or speculative elements. But when we got to the YA literature, I gave you some examples that just feature straight realism. In The Hate You Give and in Simon versus the Homo sapiens agenda, there is no speculative element at all. Of course, we know that there is plenty of YA literature that has speculative elements. Twilight is probably one of the most famous examples. But I wanted you to also see some examples of what things can look like when we take that speculative element out, which is, as we remember, part of that original Golden Age tradition. So what do we gain when we lose that aspect of the Golden Age is a question I invite you to think about this unit. All right, I hope everything goes well for you this unit. Contact me if you have questions. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.